Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this today's webinar, where we'll be talking about DPIAs from the risk step to resolution of whatever risk that you identified. I'm Bedan Deda, your moderator of the day, and also compliance analyst at TL Bridges. And I'm really excited to dive deep into this critical topic with our panelists. So I think I'll just go to introductions. So part of our panelists today is one, Chairperson, you can introduce yourself.
Okay, so I am having challenges with my video for some reason. So I'm using the browser for this session. So allow me to just introduce myself, but then I can turn on my video down the road. So good morning, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, based on where you are. This is Sifa Zokoth. I consult data protection, and I am excited to talk about, I guess, the heartbeat of one of the two heartbeats of data protection compliance, which is DPIA, and I look forward to it. Bernard?
Thank you, Sipas. Irene?
Morning, everyone. My name is Irene Joroge. I'm the founder and CEO of Chairperson Africa, and I'm passionate about cybersecurity and data privacy. Today, I'll be happy to share my insights on the DPIA. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Next, we have Charlene.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charlene Wawera. I am a data protection consultant and specialist. I am also a founding member of SK Wawera & Co Advocates. Looking forward to share my insights on data protection and particularly the data protection impact assessment. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlene. So, under regulations like the KDPA 2019, DPIAs are really essentials for identifying and mitigating the privacy risks, especially to high-risk data processing activities. And today we're going to explore how to do this effectively, from spotting risks to implementing solutions. Okay. Today our discussion is basically divided into 4 parts. Basically identifying the privacy risk. Second is the risk assessment and prioritization, mitigating strategies, and also promoting the governance and culture within the organization. So during this session, if you have any questions, you can drop it under the Q&A section of the webinar or under the chat, and we will address that as we go. So I think we'll just dive right into it. And I think the first question will go to Irene. What will you say are the most commonly overlooked privacy risks that you've seen during DPIA reviews from your experience?
Okay. Thank you, Bernard. So I'd say one of the major risks I've actually seen is risks related to third-party or vendor risks. So normally when you're doing your DPIA, you have to get the data from where it actually sits, your sources. And you tend to find that there's quite a bit of data that sits even with your third-party vendors. And usually when you're doing that, you might think that it's just the data that was required to be able to engage with your third-party vendor. But then you might tend to find that there's even much more data that's seated with them that is unnecessary. So as you're doing your risk assessment, it's important to know what kind of data you've already released to your third-party vendors. And as you're doing that risk, you should that assessment, you should be able to highlight what data you feel is over and beyond what is supposed to be with them. So then that way you're able to manage the risk, and basically that helps you to know in case of any data leakage or infiltration of data, you have this much data that sits with your third parties, and you can basically be able to know this is how much data, this is how much risk exposure you're looking at, and be able to manage it appropriately.
Okay, thank you, Irene, for that in-depth answer. So my next question is directed towards Charlene. From your experience again, what are some privacy risks that organizations tend to miss, and why do you think this happens? Why do these risks get overlooked?
All right. Thank you, Bernard, for that question. In addition to what Irina said, I think also employees and human errors are also another area that most organizations overlook, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Most organizations tend to not identify that their own internal staff or their own internal, employees can lead to data breaches. So most organizations do not train their employees to know how they handle their data, how they store their data, and most of the time, in my experience, the DPIAs that, or rather the privacy risks that I've come across, are mostly human errors which are considered internal threats. Also, not having very clear organizational policies and standard operating procedures also tied to human errors, retention policies, things like that. Those are mostly things that are overlooked by most organizations, and also collecting more information than what is required for the purpose of processing. So you can find that an organization is taking or rather collecting too much information, and the purpose of collecting this information is not very clear. So those are some of the commonly overlooked privacy risks that I've come across in my experience. Bernard.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So, Cephas, in your role as a consultant, can you tell us some situations or situations where you did a DPIA and something was overlooked, and it caused issues, and how it was caught? Also, how do you train in teams or organizations to spot these less obvious risks? Cephas? Okay, so while Cephas, I don't think you can read. Cephas, can you hear me? Okay, so I think we'll come back to Cephas. So same question to you, I think. Do you have like a specific example where an overlooked risk caused issues and how it was caught? And also, no, I think we can start with that question for now.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. I'd say there's been the human error risk and also the third party. I think I'll just still focus on the third party risk that I came across. So those ones I was conducting a DPIA, and I found that I needed to basically identify and acknowledge and see what kind of data was seated with the third party vendors. And so I had a look at the contract. I saw that this vendor is actually supposed to offer these particular services to us. But then I came to realize that even as I was checking on the data that was seated between the two organizations, there's some extra information that had been shared with them that was only necessary for some certain functionality to be done. And this was an ad hoc request that had come in, and the data had been provided to them. But then it was actually access to some data on some system. And then once the work was done, the access was not revoked. So they continued having that access. And so that was a major flag, because the person who was supposed to have rejected or removed the access to the system didn't do that. And so then the vendor also on their end did not even indicate that they were done with the access. And I think I think it was a major flag, and that was a call for us to also do other assessments to see whether there are other vendors who had additional data that they didn't actually require to have access to. So I would say that it's important to vet your third-party vendors, conduct the risk assessments as often as possible, confirm whether there's data that needs to be exposed to them that shouldn't, because it really goes a long way in case either that company is compromised or even you yourself, you're compromised, because then that means your risk exposure isn't as much. So I would advocate for that to be done as often as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So from this response, you can already tell that when it comes to DPIA, it requires cross-functional collaboration. Basically, different people need to come together when it comes to this process. And well, this one is for Cephas. Are you with us? Okay, this one is for Charlene. How critical do you think it is to involve stakeholders, and what kind of stakeholders ideally will be involved in a DPIA?
Thank you for that question, Bernard. It is quite critical to involve stakeholders in conducting a DPIA, because these are the process owners who are well aware of, the process, or rather the reason why they are collecting this particular data and what are the risks that are involved. I'd say you must involve legal, if you have a legal counsel in your organization or a legal department, because they're able to identify the risks that are associated with things like non-compliance. They're able to interpret data protection laws and ensure alignment and compliance with the laws and the regulations. They're also going to assist you in doing the risk assessment bit, So having stakeholders is really important, because you cannot conduct a DPIA in isolation. It's probably a process that is coming into the organization, or a product that you're going to collect highly information that is going to impact data subjects very highly. I'd also say you involve most systems that I have interacted with are mostly ICT or other IT related systems. So also involving the IT system will help in identifying the system risks, identify technical vulnerabilities, where the technical vulnerabilities are, things like APIs, encryptions, are these things, are these things not to make sure that these things are not overlooked. Are they tight? Or are there any vulnerabilities within the systems? And then they're also going to help in technical controls, or rather the part of the DPIA, which is mitigation measures. They can be able to assist in this, or rather in filling that part of the DPIA. So legal, ICT, the process owner as well, or rather the business teams, to help understand the operational context and the business logic of processing data. Why are they collecting this data? What will they use it for? So these are the stakeholders that are mostly important. And also, if the organization has a data protection officer, also for advisory purposes, also that is a key stakeholder that is supposed to be involved. And also, I'd also say the office of the Data Protection Commissioner, for purposes of advisory, in case the organization is not very clear on certain aspects, they can reach out to them, and they usually give guidance and advisories on such matters. So I'd say that these stakeholders are very important, because I don't think somebody can just conduct a DPIA on their own. It involves different people and different stakeholders in the organization. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Charlene. Cephas, confirm if you're here. So
Oh, now I am here. Can you hear
okay,
me?
thanks. Yeah,
Good.
we can hear you. Okay, so this one goes to you. For a DPO somewhere who needs to involve high-level stakeholders, basically the high-level people within the organization when it comes to a DPA process, how will you advise them will be the best way to get a reluctant stakeholder on board in this process?
Well, thanks, Bernard. Stakeholder engagement is interesting and tricky. I think for all intents and purposes across the various risk issues in the business. But starting with the basics, definitely there has to be awareness and information, right? So this typically should come from the top, right? The usual setting the tone from the top. approach, where you have at the very least governance instruments that instruct and inform and mandates what needs to be done. This information typically will be distributed throughout the enterprise, so that those relevant stakeholders would know that they're supposed to be involved, in matters privacy governance. And then thereafter, you need to be able to train them, make them aware of what privacy compliance involves and why it matters, right? What I've seen is that it's easy to tell people what they need to be doing, but they don't really know the root reasons for it, right? So they do it as part of ticking boxes, but really explaining why this matters for their roles, why it matters for privacy compliance, and why it matters for the business, so that everything can be tied to the core business objectives, up until including whatever business strategy or organization strategy that is there. So I'll say you start from there, educate and notify and inform. Then, of course, provide the tools that these people need to use to be able to help you out as a DPO. Yeah. While it is true that a DPIA is a multi-stakeholder engagement activity, the facilitator, the one who leads the privacy office, so you need to provide the tooling for your unit managers or risk champions, within the departments, to be able to continually interact and use to provide information that you need for the DPIA. So that becomes important, and of course you need to train them as well on how to use those tools. So I'll say you start from there and then continually have those open communications with some of these stakeholders. Of course, there's a challenge that some stakeholders might be resistive. Some stakeholders might what do we call it? They might just not be interested, or as we normally say, no one wants extra work, no one wants extra duties. So if you give them a compliance task to do, it's not in their JD per se, right? Now that's the argument. So how then do you get buy-in? I would say, at the very least, work with the unit leaders, right? Try and move them in to your side, so that then they can cascade, whether it's by instruction or whether it's by rallying their team members to be able to do what they need to do. And then at the very least, if possible, also get the patronage from the top that might then help out with call it enforcing, right? Some of these things that you need to do across the business. Bernard?
Okay, thank you very much, Sefa, for that detailed answer. So we know that when it comes to DPIAs, it involves balancing risks to the organization and to individuals. So Irene, how will you distinguish between operational risks and the data subject risks when it comes to DPIA, and why does this matter?
It's interesting. I'm actually in a training about operational risk as we speak. So operational risk, of course, by the nature of it, really relates to either the dysfunctionality and or failure of whether it be processes or systems, including even people, right? Because that the people are the ones who do the daily operational activities. So in this case, there are many different things you'd look at, right? Because it's system, people, process, and in fact, it also includes external events, right? Things like your usual catastrophes and natures, and let's say market changes, for example, event compliance, right? The new demands of data protection, how does it impact on the operational risk? So there's that whole spectrum. In terms of differentiating that from data subject risks, I'd say that there are certain operational risks that would be can be repurposed for privacy, can be repurposed as privacy risks specifically, right? And because for DPIA, we are looking at ultimately the impact on the data subject. You'll then just have to list out those operational risks as part of your usual risk assessment process, and then you provision whatever mitigation or risk approach strategies you want to take. But I would say list as many risks as possible, as long as you're able to justify the outcomes of those risks and the actual real consequences to the individual. So in my opinion, it really doesn't matter whether you differentiate or not, as long as it has an implication on the subject, that counts.
Okay, thank you, Sifas. So, Charlene, from a legal standpoint, how do you prioritize the different type of risks, especially in situations where the resources are limited? Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. So basically, to determine whether a risk is high, it's an objective and a very honest analysis of the processes and the reason why you're collecting this data. So you ask yourself, how is the risk likely, how is the risk likely to occur? And if it does, how does it impact on data subjects' rights? So it's a very objective and a very honest analysis of the risk, the impact, the likelihood of the risk occurring, and the impact on data subjects' rights. So depending on the processing activity, the process owner, the person who wants to maybe bring this product or service into the organization, and in consultation maybe with the DPO, if at all there is any, and or the legal team, they assess the likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact that it will have. And then there's a risk assessment, measure 1 to 5 that you usually do. So if the likelihood of the risk to occur is, let's say, a 3, and the impact is a 5, you get 3 times 5, you get a 15. So that means it's a high risk. So, and if the risk is likely to occur but the impact is low, then there might not, the risk assessment might just be a bit low. So it's a very delicate balance of balancing the reason why you want to collect this data and the impact that it will have on the data subjects by whom you're collecting this data from. So it's supposed to be very objective from the process the process owners. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlene. Irene, I noticed you've been quiet for a while, so this one goes to you. Around the same topic. How you, as an IT expert, how do you prioritize the different type of risk? For this one, we're talking about operational and subject risk. How do you prioritize, and how does this impact compliance within the organization?
Okay. I think what Cephas had indicated was very elaborate, but then I'd also say that even as you're doing your assessment of whether there's a data risk or operational risk that exists, you need to always prioritize data subject risks. And this is because at the end of the day, you're looking at data subjects and the data that they actually manage. So even if you're looking at a risk in terms of maybe say your website has come down, and maybe there are services that people actually consume from the website, maybe they are payment services and the like. At the end of the day, you still need to check and see whether there's any personal data that's been compromised, because now that holds a way higher risk. And so you need to be able to manage and see what exposure to my clients or to my customers is there, and bearing in mind the fact that maybe this could be data related to say their health related data or their own personal data that could easily be used by any other person. So I would always advocate for prioritizing your data subject risk even if maybe say the operational risk is low, always factor that in and have that at the back of your mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Irene. So we've talked about.
Bernard,
Okay,
if I can just mention something really still related to op risk versus prev risks. So one of the thing, actually two things rather, is that one, typically within the risk and compliance team, they would have already identified and assessed various forms of operational risks, right? And remember, risk and compliance is big, so they will handle credit risk. If it is financial institution, they'll handle operational, they'll handle environmental, etc., based on the risk appetite of the business. So probably as a protection officer, you might want to consider looking at the various risk registers or risk assessment documents for the operational risk teams, right? Because those documents can give you insights as to which operational risks would actually have implications on privacy risks or data subjects. I think that's a good place to start, even while you are, thinking of doing a whole independent or isolated privacy risk work. And then two is that because operational risk and data, let's not call it data subjects, let's call it privacy and security risks, have the commonality that they all address people, process, and systems, right? I mean, systems here could be technology systems or even process-based systems, whatever those are. So both risk domains have the same underlying fronts: people, process, systems. So clearly there's a lot of cross exchange you could do in terms of the identified issues and all of that. So I mean, in that sense, then it can help you not to reinvent the wheel, or probably not do too much work if you already have a place to start. Bernard.
Okay, thank you, Cephas. So we've talked about collaboration, we've talked about the risks and also differentiating them, but regulations require you to consult a supervisory authority when it comes to high risks that cannot be mitigated. So this one is for you, Charlene. Have you ever come across such a type of risks, and how do you assess that a risk has crossed that limit? What factors do you consider when it comes to that?
Okay, I think this depends from organization to organization based on the risk appetite that is, approved by probably the board or senior management. But in my experience, once you conduct a DPIA and you identify risks that are high risk, as I mentioned before, the manner in which you come to the conclusion that a risk is high risk is very objective. So you look at the risk, let's say something like you don't have, I'll use an example, you don't have a data protection policy, for example. So what is the likelihood of that risk occurring? Probably it's at a 4. And what is the impact on, data subject rights? That comes to maybe a 5. And there is, at the end of the day, that risk is at 20. So once you identify this risk and you do the assessment very objectively, and come to the conclusion that this risk is a high risk, then you really have to consider getting an advisory from a supervisory authority. In this case, in Kenya, is the ODPC. As I mentioned before, it's a very key stakeholder when it comes to DPIAs and data protection in general. So, and also in collaboration with the other stakeholders that we mentioned before, the legal team, the ICT team. So it's a very objective and a very honest exercise, and you just have to be very, open with the current situation that is in your organization. So from my experience, what usually happens is that that assessment that is usually done at the end of, or rather part 5 of, I think part 4, part 5 of the DPIA. So once you establish that that risk is high, then now you can reach out to the supervisory authority to get and they usually respond very quickly and give you very, very helpful advice for your organization. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So this one goes to you, Irene. Have you ever had to consult an authority during the whole process of a DPIA?
Yes, I have. I've had. Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I've had instances whereby we're doing a DPIA and we needed to get some green light from the authority. This was related to a DPIA we're conducting for an organization that required the data to be sent to their servers, and this was a cross-border kind of a data transfer. So we needed to get that green light from both the ODPC and the other authority from another country. So then that way we could align and confirm that there's no that we are within the mandate and within the regulation. So then that way we're still protecting and having the data of our customers in mind.
Okay, thank you. So this one is like a follow-up for you, Irene, again. How do you document such a process? Irene?
Sorry. So basically, it's just being able to ensure that you have all your data. So you have your data sources, you have your risk matrices, you have you ensure you have also the different clauses that you need to refer to, and you basically put all that together and ensure that there's no area that you have missed out. And even as you're doing your final report, say to management, you need to ensure that you've factored in all the different facets or aspects, so then that way you're not missing out on anything. And then also it's good to also put maybe the repercussions in case maybe a risk has been identified and it's not fixed in a timely manner. Have mitigation plans in place and the like.
Okay, thank you, Irene. Sipas, Irene has mentioned risk matrices when it comes to a DPIA. So basically, we all know that risk assessment often relies on a structured framework. So in your role as a consultant, what kind of risk matrix do you apply, and do you find this effective, or do you think there's a better one out there?
Oh, you can hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
So what should I say? So in terms of trying to figure out the risk, I guess, scoring or risk levels for a particular risk issue. So I think that I don't think the ODPC's DPIA template uses a 5x5 risk matrix, which is numerically stated 1 to 5. I know in a different conversation that I've had, there's been discussions around what if we put qualitative values to those numbers, right? So that I know what 1 is, what 2 is, what 3 and 4 and 5 are, instead of just using numbers. So anyway, whether you go the numbers way, or the qualitative way, what do you call them, the risk levels, or if you go both or you use both, I think a 5x5 matrix is fair enough. It's good enough. It gives a bit more room to be more nuanced in terms of where exactly does a particular risk lie. And then also, of course, there is also the 10 by 10 bar matrix, which I've seen in maybe 1 or 2 cases being considered, which gives even more room to the risk person to be able to more granularly be able to quantify likelihood and impact. And then, of course, if you're quantifying likelihood and severity of a risk as part of the risk matrix, then you'll also need to consider what would be the likely influences or driving factors for both likelihood and the severity, right? Because there are root causes, or there are reasons why a likelihood would be 2, 1, 3, 5, same to severity. So trying to associate the risk matrix vis-a-vis all the relevant and applicable risk influences then becomes more useful to be a bit more nuanced and as granular as possible. But
okay, thanks, Sipos. So, Charlene, when it comes to the DPIAs that you've handled, what kind of risk matrix or scoring system do you find preferable, and how do you adapt these frameworks for the different industries or project sizes?
Bernard, I don't think we are reinventing the wheel at this point. The risk matrix, or rather model, provided by the ODPC, I think is sufficient, and that is the one that I've used in my organization and various organizations that I've consulted for. So, and you find that because, as I said before, the risk identification needs to be very objective. It's quite a seamless process. Yeah. So you just you define the risk. What is the risk description? What is the consequence of this risk? What are the current controls? So these are the things that are going to inform the assessment of the risk, whether it's a 1, whether it's a 5, and then it's and then the total, the total risk assessment score. So I don't think most of the time it's the ODPC one that is usually used, and that is the one that I'd recommend to be used by organizations. I didn't get your second question very clearly.
How do you adapt these frameworks for the different industries or project sizes?
You just use this. I just use the same template rather, but it's gonna the DPIAs are gonna be different for different industries and for different organizations depending. But sometimes you find that the risks are they're cross-cutting across all industries. Unauthorized access to personal data. Inadequate internal policies and standard operating procedures. So sometimes it's they cut across, but sometimes there are some which are very unique to a particular industry or to a particular organization. But the template provided in the general regulations and also the guidelines provided by the office are sufficient, in my opinion.
Okay. So uncertainty is a big challenge in DPIAs, especially with the emerging tech like AI and stuff. So Irene, how do you handle such situations where it's hard to predict risk likelihood or impact? Sifas, you can take this one, then we'll come back to Irene.
Sorry, say that again.
In the DPIAs, especially with emerging technologies like AI, how do you handle situations where it's hard to predict risk likelihood or impact?
Oh, prediction of risk and risk likelihood and impact. I think, as Charlene had mentioned, there are those things that are just baseline applicable in most situations. So what you'll call the common risk or common risk issues and all that. Yeah. So those are a good place to start, right? As much as technology has changed, a lot of things still remain the same. Yeah. If it is people, if it is process, if it is Some issues to do with technology, for example, access controls, still the same thing, right? You know, unauthorized access is still the same. Unauthorized access might apply or show differently based on the system context. So that's a good place to start. So once you've covered those ones, as I mentioned before, thinking about risk influencers is important, right? And in fact, if you're able to have a documented library of what these risk influencers would be, the better. Of course, there are those risk drivers that would be more contextual, probably informed by current happenings, the industry, you know, things like the DPC determinations, things like how common or how rare some of these risks show based on the sector, the process, the system, etc. So there are those that are quite dynamic, but there are those that can be a bit more steady. So identifying these influences is key, because this will then inform you for all intents and purposes what the likelihood could be, or the impact could be. And part of this process, again, it's quite subjective. I have to be honest, right? It's quite subjective and will rely on a lot of professional judgment and probably some prior experiences. Yeah. But again, all this all the risk outputs would be living documentation, so they can always be updated and changed, right? So that then leaves room for you to be able to do the best risk work you can do, but then of course leaving room for changes when it's needed. So maybe one thing I'd like to mention is the issue of the risk model. Those you mentioned earlier, risk modeling, right? So if it suits you, you can take the approach to risk assessment from an adversarial perspective. So here means that, yes, we want to really just identify and describe the risk issue, but at the same time, can we go further, or rather work backwards and try to identify what really constitutes this, what constitutes a particular risk issue, right? So this could be, you could think of it as some form of root cause analysis, something like that, which is one good tool to always have in mind when you're doing risk work. So think about you know, why this risk can show, right? You know, what could be the possible you know, lags situation or gap or problem that could make this risk materialize, right? And then risk doesn't just happen, right? It is caused by something. What could be the various causes for these risks? What could be the triggers for these risks? Or who could be the people or the actors involved in making this risk materialize, right? So in a sense, let me describe it from a security perspective, you'd want to think of what are the vulnerabilities are, what are the likely threats or threat vectors, and then what are the threat actors, right? So if you use security terms, that's how it would look like, and that same mindset can be approached, can be used for processes, for governance, etc. So that's from a risk modeling perspective, so that you look at it from an advisorial perspective, and that can help you then describe extensively those risk issues when you're looking to understand what the risk levels of the mitigations are. Bernard?
Okay, thank you. Irene, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, this one goes to you. Around the same topic of emerging technologies like AI, how do you balance the gut instinct with data-driven decisions when it comes to assessing them?
Okay. as the previous speakers had mentioned, it's always good to have some documentation of sorts. And as you're documenting, you can have some scenario-based analysis. So you try and imagine what could be versus what actually is on the ground. So like for instance, if you're looking at say possibility of say the vendor data that exists, and maybe you needed to know if this data is exposed in an inappropriate manner or not. If you're coming up with a scenario that this data maybe exists, you've even done your pen test and you've been able to identify maybe any existing risks and the like, and say you have even incorporated, say, AI to do any further analysis of that data. It's always good to be aware that maybe the data you get, say, from your analysis, if you engage AI, could be false. So have that in mind. Look at, say, your possible false positives or negatives, and then look at the actual scenario on the ground. And then as you're documenting, you also engage the other stakeholders and confirm that whatever your line of thought is possibly also aligns with others. So then that way you're not too off the mark. So work with what you know based on your different DPIAs that you've conducted in the past. Work with that and use that as maybe your anchor, so that even as you're using AI, maybe in any other way, you're able to know that this is what I've been getting over time, and AI is giving me a different thing. So am I actually able to assess and see whether this makes sense? But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use any emerging technologies to assist you with your DPIA, your assessments.
Okay, thank you. So Charlene, Irene has mentioned about stakeholders. So what will be a comment on involving stakeholders to reduce the uncertainty around the emerging technologies?
Sorry, Bernard, please come again.
So Irene mentioned about involving stakeholders when it comes to emerging tech. So could you comment on the role of a stakeholder in such a situation where there is uncertainty when it comes to a DPIA process?
Yes, quite important, as we've discussed earlier, quite important to involve stakeholders in conducting the DPIA, and especially in matters emerging technologies and AI. I'd involve, expert industries. I'd involved ICT experts. I'd involve people like Irene, cybersecurity consultants and experts. It's quite an important and a significant aspect to involve stakeholders in conducting your DPIA when there are these uncertainties and emerging technologies. It's quite a challenge because AI is currently not very, it's not very regulated currently in Kenya. So it is going to really involve industry players when you're doing a DPIA, so that you can be able to have an objective and a tightly knit DPIA at the end of the day. So quite important to involve stakeholders in uncertainties and emerging trends and technologies.
Okay, thank you. So just a reminder to the attendees, if you have any questions, you can just type it under the Q&A section, and we'll address that before the end of the session. So, Sifas, what will be the most effective mitigation strategy that you've used in response to a high-risk DPIA finding?
That is an interesting question, Bernard. I can't pinpoint any at this point, but maybe my other speakers could chime in on this one. One thing I've observed as a general thing is that some of those high risk issues identified would typically be on the pure compliance side, right? So where some compliance, some obligated compliance activities are not present, and then that, of course, provides a whole non-compliance risk issue. So in that case, typically it can be very straightforward. You just need to go ahead and propose implementation of some of those compliance management practices. But allow me, maybe Irene and Charlene can chime in on this as well.
Irene, you've been mentioned. Charlene, you have a comment on that?
Yes, maybe I can chime in. The most effective, or rather, effective mitigation strategies that I can think of are, as Cephas has mentioned, are mostly in they mostly come in the compliance aspect. So I'd say if a risk is we're collecting a lot of data, more than what we require, one mitigation strategy would be to implement the principle of data minimization, right? To have clear policies and standard operating procedures in the organizations, having data retention policies, because one of the risks that is currently very glaring is having data, having outdated data or storing data that you no longer use. You're storing data for 10, 15, 20 years. Why are you storing this data? And it's no longer in use. There's the risk of this data being used in a way that was not intended to in the first place. I'd say also maybe some technical measures or some technical mitigation strategies, such as encrypting data at rest, in transit, if you're sharing this data. So those are some of the effective mitigation strategies that are used in high risk DPIA findings. Yeah,
Irene, as you comment on that question, can you also tell us how do you measure success of a mitigation strategy in your day-to-day activity?
Okay. So I liked what had been mentioned earlier in terms of trying to see how you can actually have an effective mitigation strategy. So I remember it actually took me back to an exercise that we did where we were looking at the data that existed in a database. And we found that we had data, just as Charlene had mentioned, that dated back to so many years, and it belonged even to some customers who are no longer using the service. And so we had to basically clean up that data and then even select specific data sets within the DB and see which ones we needed to maybe manage in a different way. So I remember having to work with the database teams to basically create additional databases where we could actually exfiltrate that data to move to a different database and then only work with the necessary data columns that were within the database that were necessary. And then within those columns, see which data needed to actually be anonymized or pseudonymized. And so I would really urge, if organizations are able to sit down and see the data sets that they actually have within the organizations and see what data they need and maybe see how to manage data that they don't need. So then that way, you're only working with the most basic and necessary data, and that data is properly managed and secured. I would also say look at your policies in place. Check and see, do you have sufficient policies that will be able to cater for your data privacy needs? Ensure that also there's a lot of sensitization across the organization. Find that those stakeholders that you would closely work with as a data privacy professional. But then it's also good to have that sensitization across the board. So if you're looking at, say, your customer facing employees, say your customer service officers and the like, sensitize them in such a way that even as they're engaging with the customers on a one-to-one basis or a one-on-one basis, they're also having the data privacy basics in mind, and also sensitizing the customers such that a customer already knows their
We've lost you, Erin.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Sorry about that. I would also advocate for having things like privacy notices on your websites and even in your premises, so then that way a customer is seeing that information. It's almost like the information is right in their face. So the customer knows what their rights are. They know that their data is being protected in the right way. They know so the things they can and cannot do. And then it even gives this comfort to the customers that you know what you're doing. I would also say look at, say, your websites, check and see if you have data privacy notices. Do you have a data privacy policy on your website? If you're looking at the cookies, are you, because I know there's this thing of having a deny all setting, but have like your basic default settings on your website such that a customer knows that when they visit your site, there's this basic amount of data that is collected about them, but then they also have the right to come back and have that deleted. Check your access control and other controls that you have in place. See whether you're working with mitigation, so basically reducing your data exposure footprint within the organization in all manner and forms. So are you having least privilege access to people who need to have that access? And this also touches on your third-party vendors. I think at times that gets overlooked a lot, and so it's always good to have all that in mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Erin. So, Charlene, as you comment on how you measure success over mitigation strategy, can you also tell us how do you ensure the mitigations remain effective, and especially where systems or vendors change, as Adila has mentioned, these ones do tend to get overlooked. Also, we mentioned at the start of the webinar that one of the most major overlooked risks are the ones from the third parties. So how do you measure success of a mitigation strategy, and also how do you monitor and update the mitigations to ensure they remain effective? Charlene?
Yes, how to measure the success is basically the process and the mitigation measures that you've put in place are actually working. Feedback from the process owner, the particular department or the particular organization that requested for the DPIA to be conducted. They've put in the mitigation measures in place, and their risks have actually reduced. You can review maybe after 6 months or a year, or okay, 6 months to a year probably is a bit long. Maybe 3 months, maybe quarterly. You can review on a quarterly basis, and you come back to them and ask them, okay, these are the mitigation strategies you said that you're going to put in place. If you put them in place, that means the impact and likelihood of that risk occurring and likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact on the data subjects has reduced. So that is how I'd say success is measured once a DPIA is conducted and the mitigation strategies have been put in place. How to ensure that the mitigations remain effective? I'd say by having very clear policies which outline the procedures for such occurrences, and reviewing. DPIA is, once you do it, does not mean that that's it. It needs to be reviewed on a quarterly or on a monthly or on a quarterly basis, depending on the level of risks that, or rather the risk appetite that the organization has. So in case a risk was quite high, we can review it in a month or two and find out, okay, this risk was high. These are the mitigation strategies we've put in place. Can we review them? Are they working? If they're not working, can we review them and change strategy? And the strategies must also be documented and reviewed regularly, just as I've said. There's usually a compliance register that is reviewed quarterly or annually, depending on what the internal organizational policies provide for. And also, if vendors change, or, just as Irene has mentioned, you review the contracts with the vendors to ensure that they align with the current organizational policies. And contracts can always be changed. You can amend them through addendums. You can have meetings with the vendors to try and explain to them, this is where we are at. This is what we intend to do. So just collaborate with them as well. They also need to understand why you're doing all these things. Tell them it's as per our internal policies that we need to maybe amend, change. If it's a new vendor, prior to them entering into that agreement, look at the contracts that are in place so that they're not redundant. Yeah, so that's how I'd ensure that the mitigation remains effective. Regular monitoring really works best.
Okay, thanks, Charlene. So, Sifas, in your role as a consultant, especially in situations where the DPIA are conducting, you are not involved in the inner workings of the organization, how do you ensure that what you've recommended to an organization is followed through? And how often should the DPIAs be redone, especially for the companies that don't have the internal team for this particular process?
So, sorry. So DPIA, as it's already been mentioned, is a continuous exercise, right? Same to the core privacy risk work, right? So I'd say if you've done an enterprise-wide DPIA, you probably would want to look at that at least once a year. If it is a project-based DPIA, depending on the project life cycle, you might want to maybe have a couple of reviews during the lifetime of the project. If it is a systems-based DPIA, a system could be something that would be used for a while, so you might want to develop a review cycle for that. Again, maybe a couple times a year or on need basis. As we already know that DPIA should be done in instances where you have significant changes around processing. Yeah, could be for the process specifically or processes around that system. So whatever works for you, I guess the plan is always to have a regular review in a time that is not too long, right? Could be biannual or something like that. But then also that can be informed by the existing risk management frameworks in the business, right? You might want to talk to the risk guys and ask them how often do they do their risk manuals, right? How often do they review? If it is security guys, then or IT guys, then you might also want to consider what is their review cycles. Maybe those can help to inform what the privacy office can do. There's something else. I suppose, I don't know if you asked this, but in terms of measurement of the DPIA, again, DPIA is risk assessment, right? With an extra component of impact. At least that's how I see it, right? So as same to any other risk work, you'd want to have key risk indicators. So these are just metrics with which you'd want to be able to track and monitor, so that you can then quantifiably measure what's working, what is not. Of course, all this has to be done by internal team. So as a consultant, I mean, you will not be there doing this. So whatever happens, that is the role of the internal team, the stakeholders, to be able to do it. Best you can do, as has been mentioned, if it is within your scope, then you would want to maybe just do check-ins. But then you can't keep on doing check-ins. At the end of the day, it relies on it's the role of the client to be able to make use of whatever recommendations or proposals that have been made for their own improvement.
Okay, thank you, Sifas. So in the interest of time, at least let's try to keep our next response short. So we've talked about identifying the privacy risks. We've talked about risk assessment and prioritization, and we've talked about mitigation strategies. So how do we ensure, this what goes to you, Charlene, how do we ensure that a DPIA being conducted is basically is a thorough one and not simply a box ticking DPIA for the organization?
Okay, thank you, Bernard. As we mentioned earlier, it's a very honest and a very objective process, and so the steps by which, or rather the guidelines given by the regulator in both the regulations and in the guidelines should be followed, should be adhered to strictly. Yeah. So all the parts are supposed to be filled effectively and honestly and objectively, and have also concrete and tangible and practical mitigation measures depending on your organization. Involve the relevant stakeholders, as we've mentioned before. The DPO, involve them if they are there. The legal team, the compliance team, the process owner, if it's ICT, involve every stakeholder in the process. Have a compliance monitoring tool. Yes, you've said you're putting mitigation measures. After how long? You can say we don't have a data protection policy. We intend to have a data protection policy. By when? Put timelines and adhere to those timelines. So if you say you have a policy within 6 months, at the end of those 6 months, check whether you have that policy. Check whether you have an implementation strategy in place to ensure that the policy is being implemented through the organization. And then, so basically, DPIA helps. It's a compliance tool, and it's a journey. It's a process. So monitoring it and having realistic measures in place and trying to reduce the risks as much as possible is what I'd say is a good, it's good practice, and it's not just a ticking box, because yes, it is required, but you just don't do it just for the sake of it. And also timelines. When are you doing this DPIA? You should submit it 60 days prior to the processing. Submit it to the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner 60 days prior. So when are you doing it? Are you doing it after, just to tick a box, or are you actually doing it within the timelines that is given by the Act and the regulations? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Irene, same question. What will you say distinguishes a thorough DPIA from one that's just checking boxes?
Over and above what Charlene has said, which was very, very elaborate, is that you must make sure that one thing I make sure is that you have to have the stakeholder input. And I said this is why I said this. It's because if you're just basically barely scratching the surface, and you assume that you can be able to get the information, but then you're actually not really engaging with them to understand what exactly is on the ground, I would say that you would have a very effective DPIA in place. I'd also say it's been mentioned before that there's no need to reinvent the wheel, because there's the ODPC template that's already in place. But then make sure that it's custom fit for your organization. Maybe there could be some things that you feel you need to also factor in. Don't basically just basically use a template, but then you customize it if you feel like there's that need, so that then that way you're not missing out on any areas. And then also check and see whether maybe the risks that you keep identifying, are they as definitely you need to keep doing your risk assessments as often as possible. Make sure that the risks that are identified are actually what is on the ground. Don't just mark maybe a risk as low just for the sake of it. If you feel that it's supposed to be a high risk and it's a high risk because you've actually checked and seen that the impact of this risk is actually really high, mark it as that and work together with the stakeholders to see how that can be fixed or remediated. So yes, customize, engage your stakeholders, and then just do the things as they're meant to be done. Like don't what would I use? Don't bring down a risk just for the sake of it. So then that way you're not finding that you have too many high risks. No. Do your assessment and make sure that it is actually as it is, and then work together to see how that risk can be mitigated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Cephas, this one is for you. As a consultant, I assume you have also taken part in training various people with different levels of knowledge when it comes to privacy. So how do you train the non-privacy teams to have a DPIA mindset where they don't consider it as slowing things down or a burden?
Maybe you don't, Bernard. Because people will still think compliance is here to slow things down, especially when you have to address these compliance issues downstream or towards the end of our product development, before launch or before a process introduction and things like that. But having said that, as I mentioned earlier, setting the tone from the top, if it is there, good enough, then that cascades down through the management and through the operations level, so that people know this is an obligation and a mandate of the business, right? That has to be known, right? Two, in terms of having a risk mindset, I think this is a multi-stakeholder push from risk compliance, push from the privacy office, push from maybe IT security and other risk players, and then also push from the top, right? Because ultimately, everything risk is owned by the ultimate decision makers. It's your board or your senior leadership. They only get a chance to be able to delegate, all that risk duties to the rest of us, I believe. Sorry. So yeah, keeping reminding them of thinking risk is good through those education forums, but it's even better if you provide them with tools and you enable them or empower them to use those tools, so that if they see anything, they can say something, right? If they want to do something, they can consult. Yeah, I've had a client recently who whose DPO has complained a lot that they're not being involved in things within the business. They're not being involved when things are being developed and created and changed in the business, right? Because those people just don't think privacy risk is real, right? They just don't care enough until they actually do, right? So, which is, like I said, way down the road, which then creates all sorts of delays, all sorts of blocks, as you mentioned, all sorts of tick box activities, because they just want you to do a DPA for the sake of it and all that. So it becomes a whole problem. So I guess education, awareness, information, tooling, and at the same time getting involved, right? The privacy officer has to be involved. So, that then helps the privacy team to, at the very best, at least do some extensive work in terms of risk, or provide meaningful advice, because that's the role of a DPO, right? Provide a lot of advice to the teams at the earliest. So of course, if I can extend that submission, is with regards to let me mention some regards to the DPC template. I totally agree with Irene. I think it's important to look beyond the template for internal reasons, internal purposes, be able to extend that framework so that you really cover your bases in a way that is operationally meaningful for the business, so that it's not just filling that form and then submitting it to the regulator. In a sense, that could be considered a tick box exercise, right? Yeah. But extending that genuinely in a way that speaks to your context as a business is important. And then there are many, many different aspects of DPIA that, in my opinion, are not even covered in the template. Or I think the template should be revised for that matter. But yeah, I hope that helps, Bernard.
Okay, thank you. So as we come to the end of our webinar today, so Irene, you can start with you. Will you give us some few closing remarks? Just a minute. Irene?
I would say that one, I think we're already in the right direction. I remember when we had started talking about data privacy a while back, and now we have an entire law in place. We have templates in place. We have an ODPC office in place. We have DPOs in place. So I think we're already in the right direction, and I would encourage that more and more organizations do what they need to do, consult, attend this kind of webinars, talk to different practitioners within the industry, learn from each other, do a lot of benchmarking. And this will go a long way in terms of improving how we do our DPIAs. It will go a long way even in terms of how we secure our data for our customers. Because at the end of the day, I think this also translates back into customer satisfaction and even your sales. So it's an entire holistic approach. And I would say that it's beneficial if you know where to start. And if you need guidance, you can always reach out to the stakeholders or people who are already doing what they're doing within this industry. Learn and see how you can implement the same. And then remove the checkbox mentality from your head. It's deeper than that. Remember that you're playing a role within the organization. And so yours is to see how you can actually improve the entire posture of that organization. So always work with a different kind of a mentality, and I'm sure that there will be more benefits to how you're doing all your assessments. And then also work closely with your leadership, work closely with all the other stakeholders, and eventually to stop feeling like you're the policeman. But then because at the end of the day, you're supposed to work together as a team, and do lots of trainings and the like. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Irene. Charlene, 30 seconds to give us your closing remarks.
Well, I think Irene has basically summarized it all, but what I'd like to add is that DPIA is a compliance tool. It looks like a really big giant, but it is not. It is possible to do it, and it also reduces the risks of the organization, because in case there's a breach, once you have submitted this report to the office and maybe a breach occurs later on, at least there'll be a bit of laxity on their end. And also, just let us just avoid the penalties, the fines that the regulator is issuing out because of lack of compliance. And in case of any confusion, as Irene said, reach out to consultants, experts in the industry. The regulator itself is really helpful. Don't really fear. Data protection is it's relatively new in Kenya, and it's a journey. And it's possible to reach some level of a good compliance level. So it is possible, and people should not really fear it. Thank you very much, Bernard, for organizing this webinar, and I look forward to more of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Cephas, 30 seconds.
So, one, think privacy. And also, let's think risk, right? In this case, privacy risk. The earlier you do it, the better. And then also beyond that, think about consequences to your stakeholders, your members, your customers, your employees, and all that, which is basically what DPIA is. So do the risk work early on, then consider what the consequences could be, real life consequences. You'll be good to go.
Okay, thank you, Cephas. So for the audience, I hope you've learned the importance of early stakeholder involvement, the practical risk models here, and also how to embed DPIAs into the daily workings of your organization. Huge thank you to our panelists, Irene, Charlene, and Cephas, for sharing their expertise and experience, and also sharing with us their knowledge around the privacy environment and DPIAs. This session will be uploaded on YouTube if you want to go back and check something. Also, we welcome you all to our next webinar next month. The date and the topic will be communicated early. And thank you all for joining us. Stay safe, stay privacy conscious, and see you next month.